Hello everyone, this is the Shientist, and I'm going to do this audio and podcast on an hopefully an interactive topic or subject entity that anyone and everyone can sort of relate to, at least in one way or another. This is part of the molecular storm gauge series, and can you believe it? There's actually just another two more audios or podcasts part of this series, and that will be this series done. But this is on this audio podcast will be on faith, science, and medicine, the perpetual link. And this is another Storm Robotics production. So I'm going to break this down into a bit of an introduction, some understanding around healthcare practice, and some context in bringing everything together in a summary. And then I'll make some suggestions for some further reading or references. So faith, science, and medicine, and the perpetual link. What's that all about? So a bit of introduction then on this. In the history of medicine, and before I crack on with this, I will be focusing on where at least where aspects of faith is concerned. I will perhaps give provide the sort of relate the context into from a sort of an Islamic perspective, and draw on some examples on that as well. So, in the history of medicine, Islamic medicine, also known as, for example, Arabic medicine, and I don't mean like anything, and this is not to be confused with or related to anything like voodoo or anything like that, but it refers to the science, the science of medicine developed in the Islamic or Golden Age, and written in Arabic, the lingua franca of Islamic civilization. Now, some context around the Golden Age, and focus around and understanding and focus around the Islamic perspective on health and medicine has been highlighted by an author, Porter, in 1999. Beginning in the 7th century, Islam spread to a large part of the then known world. Under the rule of the Islamic caliphs, people of various ethnic origins and religious beliefs actually lived together, worked together, and were collaborative, and actually sort of moved heaven and earth in one way or in at least one way or another, to ensure to an extent, in aspects of healthcare, that there was sort of holistic practices under the rule under the rule of the the Islamic caliphs. Caliphs basically are those who, you can say, in one way or another, it refers to caliphs or caliphs relate to leaders, who perhaps had specialist intrigues in different areas of practices. And so apart from that, the language, the common language of communication was mainly in the main Arabic, and the culture that was created or sort of developed was called it was um, uh, was sort of it was as mainly in line with Arabic culture, um, but then that's not Arabic culture, by the way. Is not to be confused with uh, uh, sort of confused or misaligned with the Muslim faith, because where that's concerned, that extenuates and extends over um, uh, um, those who are simply, for example, from Arabic background. Those who are Muslim, for example, um, at least listeners would know that Muslims come from different backgrounds. But in at least aspects of the Islamic Golden Age, and where healthcare was concerned, and obviously the common language was Arabic, and um, it even included, apart from Muslims, it did have there was efforts to bring solid, sort of holistic approaches in practice between Muslims, Jews, Christians, and other religions or other faiths, I should say, alike, under the rule of Islam. And uh, there is a paper, actually, that is quite dated, but gives some of that historical context. It's a paper, I believe, that's published by Khalil in 1944. The Islamic medicine has in one way or another has been faithfully preserved, has faithfully been preserved, and sort of systemized and further developed, and further sort of helped develop the medical or clinical knowledge, um, um, uh, in some aspects, um, relating to classical antiquity. There's some more context around that by Campbell in 2013. During the post-classical era, Islamic medicine was the most advanced in the world, integrating concepts of the ancient Greek, the Roman, the Persian, as well as the ancient Indian traditions of Ayurveda, Ayurveda. And at the time, the knowledge of the classical medicine actually was nearly lost to the medieval medicine of Western Europe, only to be regained by European physicians when they became familiar with Islamic medical authors, and sort of learned and sort of liked the sort of practices and the approaches that had, and that they had, and also how that had benefits or advantages in European, in line with European areas and practice of medicine and healthcare, um, during, for example, the Renaissance of the 12th century. And that context has been highlighted by Conrad in 2009. The medieval Islamic physicians largely retained authority until the rise of medicine as part of the natural sciences, beginning with the age of what is known as the Age of Enlightenment, sort of nearly 600 years after textbooks were composed around subjects in sort of natural sciences and healthcare and medicine. Many aspects of retrospective writings are still actually have sort of a pivotal premise today in today's world, and such contribution is held in high retrospect by many physicians, quite a few physicians between healthcare practices today as well. And that some of that understanding or further context can be understood, sort of approached in a paper publication, I believe, by Colgan in 2013. I'm now going to talk a little bit about healthcare practices and bring in some more of that understanding in line with the introduction. Arabian physicians became sort of familiar with Greco-Roman and late Hellenistic medicine through and by practicing in the newly conquered regions rather than reading the original or translated works. And so whilst there was intrigue by sort of retrospectively, for example, those in European countries learning from those in the Arabian peninsulas, there was also this understanding where the tradition, the Arabs, sort of, and those from for example, those who from Arab cultures, and also those who are from Muslim faith or Muslim backgrounds, they also learned from sort of the European culture in aspects of healthcare and medicine as well. It was a bit of a crossover, but at the same time, they learned from one another in at least and across different sort of specific areas of medicine. So, for example, I'll give an example in aspect of hematology. There's a technique to actually extract bone marrow, where consultant hematologists in today's world, they would use different instruments to extract bone marrow from the individual's sort of spinal regions, to get an understanding of the extent of certain, for example, certain leukemias, etc. Now, with that in mind, there was these two instruments, or this instrument had two different sort of connotations, and one was actually called has the Islamic dome at the end, like has the Islamic dome shape, and and one has the other would have like I believe it's like a sort of almost a semi-flat shape as well. And basically, in that context, that at least from a hematological premise, there is some evidence that Islam and that faith contributed into areas of hematology, at least where this important area of practice was concerned. And the other side of this is that the translation emerging Islamic text sort of in across several ways may have facilitated sort of what was learned in those sort of Arab peninsulas, including contexts in areas of practice, but sort of in and around between Damascus and as in line with sort of Syrian medicine, and which was also part of that ancient tradition. Then there were the names of two sort of Christian physicians were also known at the time. There was and they had even the Christians in that time had sort of semi Arab connotations. So, for example, one of these Christian physicians were known to be Ibn Atal, and worked at the court of Muawiyah, and it was a founder of the of part of the Umayyad dynasty. And there was another one who had the name Abu Hakam, who was responsible for the preparation of medicines employed by Muawiyah. And Abu Hakam's son, grandson, and greater-grandson were also part of serving the Umayyad and the Abbasid Caliphate. There's more around this particular focus. I don't want to delve into it too much because I don't want to get my evidence mixed up in any way. But there's context around this in a paper actually by Sezian. It's quite dated as well, but it's from the 1970. The development and growth of hospitals in ancient Islamic society expanded actually the areas of medical practice to what is currently known as surgery or where surgeons obviously perform surgical procedures. And surgical procedures were known to physicians during the medieval period because of earlier texts that included descriptions of certain procedures or specific procedures. And there's a paper actually by an author called Pullman in 2007 around this. Translation from pre-Islamic medical publishings was a fundamental building block for physicians. for physicians and surgeons, in order to actually expand areas of healthcare practice. So what we know is there was areas of healthcare practices dating back to sort of the Golden Age, and beginning in the 7th century. And there was a mixture of contributions and areas of focuses between that time and dynasty, that delved into that kind of poured into efforts in and around the Europe and vice versa. Surgery was commonly practiced by physicians and other medical affiliates due to the very low success rate, even though earlier records provided favorable outcomes to certain operations or procedures, and that's more around that is sort of highlighted by Pullman in 2007. There is now perhaps more work around linking areas of at least around areas of sort of health psychology, and for example health psychology and areas of a specific area of healthcare practice, and drawing on examples by those sort of doing their efforts and in and around the works of the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG, and in linking sort of nephrology, or the study of kidney care practice, and or the study of the kidneys, aspects of faith and health psychology, and drawing on literature that is a mixture or integration or integrated or collaborative between different disciplines. The RPSG, or the Renal Patient Support Group, of those who are involved in that effort, have some published works, at least in poster presentation format, to bring examples of how, for example, reciting and reading the Book of the Muslims, or the Quran, can help potentially promote positive coping strategies. That's obviously something that was practiced in one way or another in sort of historically. I'm now going to draw on a summary on this, and that is to say, the Western Caliphate produced physicians and philosophers almost as brilliant as those of the East. Remarkable schools of medicine were founded in different places around Europe. Seville, Toledo and Cordova. The most famous of the professors was also known were known as Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, and then there is Al-Zahrawi, who's known as Albucasis, and Ibn Zuhr, who is known as Avenzoar, and a lot of the context, historical writings, published works relating these different sort of contributors to healthcare practices have been highlighted in works by Osler in 1921. I believe the academic lead for the renal patient support group of the RPSG has put some context relating to the works of Ibn Zuhr in a poster presentation, and that can be sort of approached and I think downloaded from the renal patient support group's ResearchGate page, which highlights quite a few publications in different formats, including a summary of Ibn Zuhr's life around aspects of healthcare, medicine, and aspects of surgery. So that's where I'm going to draw this to a close. I will highlight a few references and sources for further reading, and there is the reading list around this is actually quite extensive, but I will give some main ones. There is works by Abu-Raya and team in 2009 when they look at the multi-religion identity measure, a new scale for use with diverse religions, and it was a paper publication published in the Journal of Muslim and Mental Health in 2009. There's works by again Conrad in 2009, looking at the Western medical tradition, sorry, it's a book publication, not a paper publication, and it's in a book titled again the Western medical tradition, and it looks at that from 800 to it looks at early century, sorry, and it's a Cambridge Press publication. The paper by it's a book publication in 2013 by Colgan, and is titled as Advice to the Healer on the Art of Caring, and it's published in Berlin, a Heidelberg book publication, or a publisher's Heidelberg Springer publication. There is a publication by Dein, D-E-I-N, that is, and 2005, that do look at sort of spirituality, psychiatry, and participation, sort of a cultural analysis, and there's also works by Dunn in 1998, Identity Crisis, a social critique of modernity, and that's published in the University in a University of Minnesota press publication. There is works by Eaton, 1994, and that's a publication, a book publication called Islam and the Destiny of Man, and it's a really good read. So I would recommend listeners checking that out. There's Eaton in 2005, sorry, in 2000, and he has a book he had a book publication called Remembering God, and there is works by Folkman in 1997, Positive Psychological States and Coping with Severe Stress. And there's Folkman and Lazarus in 1988, Coping as a Mediator of Emotion. That was published in another psychology journal. There's Folkman and Lazarus and team in 1986. One of the earlier publications by the author. Folkman, Appraisal, Coping, Health Status and Psychological Symptoms. There's also Folkman and Moskowitz in 2000, Positive Affect and the Other Side of Coping. There's Folkman and Moskowitz in 2004, which and this particular publication is probably what most people in and around looking at aspects of coping to get a kind of bases and definitions and understanding of measure. The paper by Folkman and Moskowitz was perhaps kind of the go-to or seminal paper on coping, and it's titled Coping Pitfalls and Promise. It was again published in a psychology journal. Works by Ghali in 2008, Physical and Spiritual Treatment of Disability in Islam, and looks at perspectives of early and modern jurists. Journal of Religion, Disability and Health. There is works by Guilford and team that look at healthcare, asking the question really, what does access to healthcare mean? And that's published in 2002. There's a paper by there's a publication by Hall and team, Hall and Livingston in 2006, looking at mental health practice and Arab families, and it looks at the authors look at the implications of spirituality vis-a-vis in Islam. So that was a 2006 publication, and there's a publication in 2001 by Hostetter in 2001, prevalence of end-stage renal disease due to type 2 diabetes. There's a publication by Lazarus in 1992, and coping with the stress of illness. And there's a publication by Lazarus again and team much earlier, in 1957, believe it or not, on personality and psychological stress. There's a really invigorating paper by Leonard and in 2000, and I would consider this as a kind of a really sort of exciting paper publication for those who like to get an understanding around the immune system and immunology, and the effects that has relating to stress, and sort of psychology. And the paper is called or titled Stress, Depression and the Activation of the Immune System. And Leonard also publishes on other areas, including there was actually a paper by Leonard and Meint in 2009 that who looks at the psychoneuroimmunology of depression. There's also the paper by Lewin and team in 2007, Aspects of Spirituality Concerning Illness. And there's a book publication by Moss in 1998. That's MAUSS. And the book publication is called A Category of the Human Mind, the Notion of Person, the Notion of Self. And it's in the chapter. It's a book chapter in a book by Carruthers, Collins, and Lukes. In the book, The Category of the Person. It's a Cambridge University Press publication. There is a book on diseases of the hearts and their cures, and it's actually published by Dara Sunnah Publications. And this is a book, sort of a perspective from a known author from the Islamic world, or the Islamic perspective, Ibn Taymiyyah, and this particular book publication is from 2003. And there's a book, another sort of famous book actually, relating to Islam, and bring out the sort of the perspective from sort of the fundamentals around the Islamic faith. Zuhr G in 1984. And it's titled Islam, Beliefs and Teachings, and it's and there's also a book, not a book, it's a paper publication in 1997 by Schwarz and Ridder, Integration of Coping and Social Support Perspectives, and it highlights implications for the study of adaptation to chronic diseases, and there is a book, a paper publication. It's quite an informative one, for example, that looks at perspectives from population health and epidemiology, sort of in relating to current times. In the more modern world, and that is a paper by Sheikh in 2007. I believe it's Ahmed Sheikh, and it's 2007, and he questions, should Muslims have faith-based health services? It was published in a British medical journal. And then finally, I want to highlight the book I mentioned. Oh, sorry, one of the authors I mentioned in 1944. This book, this work is titled is by Khalil in 1944. Arabic Medicine in Literature, Bulletin of the Medical Library Association, and then there's the book, another book called by Zibiri in 1997. It's a really good kind of go-to book to look at perspectives from Muslims and Christians, actually, and doesn't really, this particular book publication isn't so focused on actual health perspectives, but actually give a historical perspective on kind of aspects of societal the societal divide in some perspective, from at least a couple of stances. So Zibiri looks at that, and the book publication is 1997. Is called Muslims and Christians Face to Face, and that's a really good that's a good read. That's where I'm going to leave it, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you can check out some of those resources. It's been a sort of a good time for even for the Shientists to kind of ponder on some of these, because I have no clue how important really aspects of faith kind of intertwine with areas of healthcare practice. If I wasn't looking at some of the literature that's come across by Eaton and Zibiri and Gali and Zuhr, and even the works by Mohammed as sort of the academic lead on behalf of the Renal Patient Support Group. I would have sort of struggled to kind of make that perpetual link. So this has been a learning curve for me, for the Shientist, and hopefully now looking forward to doing the next audio podcast on another intriguing area of healthcare research and areas of science and medicine. So once again, this has been the Shientist. This was an audio podcast under the molecular storm gauge, and this has been another Ztorm Lobostics production. Thanks again. Take care.